Good afternoon. The time is 1 p.m. and I would like to call to order the Finance, Administrative, and Procurement Subcommittee meeting for today, Wednesday, May 8, 2024. We are located at 1999 Harrison Street, Suite 2300 in Oakland, and there are remote locations marked on the agenda. Members of the public wishing to make a comment can do so either by raising the raise hand function in Zoom or *9 if you are joining through telephone. Would you please take roll?
Yes. Director Anderson. Director Anderson.
Here.
Director Bedoya. Director Gonzalez.
Present.
Director Kaur.
Present.
Director Cox. Here we have a quorum.
We have a quorum. It has been established. We will now move to item 2, public comment. Public comment is reserved for members of the public wishing to make a comment on non-agenda items. Members of the public will have 2 minutes to give their comment. Are there any members of the public wishing to make a comment on a non-agenda item?
There is one member of the public with their hand raised. Local Clean Energy Alliance, you are recognized to speak for 2 minutes.
Hi, can you hear?
Thank you. Yes, please go ahead.
Oh, great. Jessica Tovar, Local Clean Energy Alliance, longtime coordinator of the East Bay Clean Power Alliance. And just wanted to just reiterate that we have been working with community organizations who are doing resilience hub work throughout Ava territory, Alameda County and Stockton communities. And just wanted to uplift, the ask has been to fund resilience hubs using surplus money from the agency. The ask specifically was for $15 million. I appreciate that the agency is offering solar and storage incentives, but certainly resilience hub needs there's so many more. Think about the need for cooling centers during extreme heat days, the air filtration we would need during smoke days, the ongoing refrigeration that's needed. All of these require having electricity, but also require resources. And in addition, community-based organizations have made it very clear that they even need money just for basic organizing and planning for disaster. And this is a good opportunity for the agency to support community-based organizations that are doing this work now instead of waiting until disaster. I appreciate that this agency did respond during the COVID-19 emergency, but this is a great time for us to plan in advance so that our communities are not hit so hard and can weather the storm, whatever that might be. Clean power to the people. Thank you.
Thank you. We have another member of the public with their hand raised.
Are there any other members?
Yes, Jordan Ackerman, you're recognized for 2 minutes.
Jordan, please go ahead.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to again acknowledge, the work that you guys are doing, and uplift the fact, the potential that this program is an opportunity to provide high road employment. I'm with the Construction Trades Workforce Initiative. We've partnered with AVA in the past. So I just want to uplift this opportunity for high road employment from the program. We're expecting that the developer will work with the building trades to develop an agreement for the project. And we're hoping to have that done prior to coming back to the board. So just want to, note the opportunity for high road employment from the program. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Jordan. Are there any other public comments?
There are no other members of the public with their hand raised.
We will now move to item 2. I'm sorry, we will now move to the next item, which is the approval of minutes. Uh, Are there any questions or comments or corrections from the directors before we do that? Seeing and hearing none, would anyone like to make a motion to approve the minutes?
I would be happy to move approval of the minutes from March 13th, 2024.
Motion made by Director Anderson. Is there a second?
I'll second. Member Gonzalez.
Thank you, Member Gonzalez. Motion made by Director Anderson and seconded by Director Gonzalez. Please take roll.
Director Anderson,
Aye.
Director Bedoya, Director Gonzalez,
Aye.
Director Core,
Aye.
Director Cox. Minutes are approved.
Okay. We can now move to the next item. Let me go ahead and toggle to my next item. It looks like the next item is the 2024-25 draft budget review informational item. Is there a presentation?
Yes, there is.
Wonderful.
So we pull that up, please. We can jump to page 2. Good afternoon. I'll be presenting on our draft budget for fiscal year 24-25. As a quick note, we did present this same version to the executive committee last week. That was the first review of our draft budget, and we intend to plan it next week to the full board. And then in June, we'll bring forth an action item for approval based off of any additional comments and incorporations that we make to this draft budget. For the most part, this presentation is very similar to what we presented in the past in terms of details and review. It does begin with a few slides just on general sort of rate setting process, rate trends, some of the billing process, and that is responding to a request from board members just to provide a little bit of that sort of initial baseline knowledge. So if we can go to the next slide, Raisa. A little bit very intro information on energy delivery itself. We as AVA as a load serving entity in California, we schedule and deliver all of our energy through CAISO, California Independent Service Operator. And we are charging our customers for the generation portion on the bill. PG&E continues to charge for the transmission and delivery portions of the bill. And then we manage that load that we schedule into CAISO through a variety of contracts and hedges for energy products, brown power, RECs, and resource adequacy. We do that scheduling on a day ahead basis, and then in real time, we do updates to that load scheduling based off of sort of actual loads needed. Next slide, Raisa. A little bit of information on the rate process itself and historical trends. I'll point us to the bottom left graph here, which is a nice sort of historical snapshot since AVA has served customers. In blue, we have our average generation rates. That's average across residential and commercial customer classes. We have in pink sort of the PCI portion. So in total, those two portions would add up to the generation related costs that customers have. And then you can see two lines there. The green is sort of our cost of service, and then the orange is a reflection of our margin or surplus. What is really noteworthy here is really some relatively stability in rates between 2019 and 2022. And you can see clearly in 2023 onwards, rates have elevated. And of course, that has created more and more dialogue around affordability and concerns around energy rate increases. As you can see, this is driven primarily based off of cost of service. So that green line reflects our cost of service to go procure the necessary energy, and that is increasing sort of in line with those rates increasing. The graph on the right, a little bit of an eye chart, but maybe the main takeaways I'll share here is, as you can see, there's quite a bit of volatility in energy markets. What this is CAISO NP15 day ahead prices. That is a pretty close proxy for our actual wholesale costs that we pay for when we schedule with CAISO directly. Technically, ours are PG&E DLAP, but the NP15 is the sort of closest publicly available data source for that. The black straight lines are just the average across the calendar year, so the annual average there. And in particular, you can see there's a significant spike back in 2022 winter, if we recall the significant sort of cold snap in Texas impacts to broader national energy markets. Next slide, please, Raisa. A little bit on our billing. I won't go into this in a lot of detail. Maybe the points I'll make are PG&E continues to serve as a billing agent on our behalf. They remit one bill to the customer. Customer pays that bill. There is a generation portion and there's a T&D portion. Those funds are remitted to AVA after PG&E receives them. And as you can imagine, there's a typical lag there where at the end of their particular billing period, we process the bill, we send it out, and then there's a payment lag that exists. I simply highlight that to just note there's other working capital and cash needs that we manage in the process, and you'll typically see a sort of a 3-month cycle before we receive those funds. Next slide, Lisa. So a little bit more on our rates and revenue. So as we all know, we have 2 primary energy products, Renewable 100 and Bright Choice. Renewable 100, when we launched our operations, we started from a penny above PG&E rates. That has migrated down over the years. It is currently set at a 1/4 cent above PG&E rates. For Bright Choice, which is about 81% carbon free, that was originally set at a 1.5% discount to PG&E. That was reduced to a 1% discount in 2021 with some compression in that headroom to operate. And then since has increased again, increased to 3% in 2022, increased to 5% in 2023, and we are proposing an increase to 7% in this year's budget. So that is certainly of note. You'll see the graph in the bottom left is just a breakdown between our Bright Choice customers, both residential and C&I in the dark blue and light blue, and then for Renewable 100 in the light green and dark green. The black line is the percent Bright Choice, and in between 24 and 25, you can see it increases slightly, and that is because we're expanding our service to Stockton and Lathrop, and they're defaulting to Bright Choice service. Of note, I'll just say is that we are in active discussions on additional jurisdictions potentially opting up. Fremont and Oakland are 2 large cities that are considering that default change right now. So that is not accounted for in this graph. Next slide, Raisa. So with that, the slides going forward are really more directly focused on the budget, and these are very similar to what we've presented in prior years in terms of reviewing various cost and revenue details. What I'll note here, we're all aware we are in generally a rising energy cost environment. I'll say what's noteworthy for 24-25 is it's somewhat stable in terms of energy costs, where we've seen over the last couple of years quite a bit of volatility and quite a significant increase in energy prices. It seems to be stabilizing a little bit in 24 and going, at least in terms of our forecast, into 2025. But unfortunately, it is remaining stable at somewhat of an elevated level. Of course, there is a tremendous amount of uncertainty as to what will actualize, but that is what we're forecasting right now. A quick summary of some of the main takeaways from this draft. We are proposing a change to the value proposition for Bright Choice, so it would be an increase from 5% to 7% discount to PG&E. We are not proposing or recommending a change to the Renewable 100 rate, and I'll speak about that in a little bit more detail in the future slides. We are recommending a significant contribution to our reserves, consistent with what we're doing this particular fiscal year. It's an increase to our carbon-free energy procurement targets. It is a sort of a generally consistent budget for our local development programs. And then we are requesting a further expansion of our staff size, additional 15 heads, which is consistent with what we requested this year as well. Next slide. Here is sort of the summary snapshot of the budget year. So in the table to the right, we have our fiscal year 24-25 budget. That's the column highlighted in yellow. You can see in comparison to that, what our current fiscal year, the FY 24 budget, that is what was approved with the board last year. And then the column all the way to the right is our actuals for this fiscal period. The dollar and the percent differentials are the difference between fiscal year 25 budget and fiscal year 24 budget. I've noted the value proposition change to 7% already. I've noted the request for additional headcount of 15 FTEs. I think I'll cover additional details in further slides. So why don't we, let me touch on just a couple quick points on the table itself and some of the financials. You can see another strong fiscal period forecast. So net position of about $153 million, quite strong in comparison to our current fiscal year. The budget was around $200 million, and the actuals right now are forecast around $225 million. So $150 million is a very strong financial year, a little softer than what we're currently experiencing. But there, as a result of that, there is a strong allocation to reserves that we're recommending, and that is certainly part of what's driving us to recommend an increase to the value proposition of 7% discount to PG&E. Yeah, okay. Raisa, can you move on to the next slide? So some of the other key assumptions, of course, touch on the value proposition. We have included a $50 bill credit to Care and Fair customers. That is what we did in this particular fiscal year as well. And that totals about $6.5 million in bill savings. So we were proposing that in our base case, similar to this year. The current rates are somewhat flat, slightly softer in 2025. And PCI, there is a modest increase there, but generally fairly stable in both rates and PCI going to 2025 calendar year. We are putting in place a 1% uncollectibles rate, which is consistent with what we've generally done. No recognition to the GASB 62, and there is an increase in non-operating interest rates, and that's generally just due to a higher interest rate environment, as well as outsourcing our treasury management and investment policy to a third party, which we recently approved. Energy costs, as noted, sort of some general volatility, elevated prices in the market. We are proposing an increase on carbon free. So what we have in calendar year 2024 is total carbon free, which is renewables and large hydro at 81%. Our prior board approved schedule was at 71%. So this incorporates a 10% sort of adder to that number. And then for calendar year 2025, we are proposing a similar 81% level. That board approved schedule was at 76%, so it's a 5% adder. So it would sort of maintain that at a relatively stable level. I noted the 15 FTE, and last point is we have a local development budget proposed at just shy of $24 million. And we also have a forecasted budget surplus of around $19 million based off of a surplus waterfall, which is consistent with what we presented this year as well. Next slide. I've noted the value proposition now a few times in rates, so I won't go into that. I think the noteworthy points on this slide are, if you assume our current load distribution for Bright Choice and Renewable 100, if for every 1% discount to PG&E, that equates to about a $7.2 million impact to our revenues and therefore our net position. And for every $0.25 change in the Renewable 100 value proposition, that results in about a $5.3 million change in revenue and directly to net position as well. We show those in case we want to consider other scenarios for adjustments of value proposition. We can think about what the impact is overall from a financial perspective. And then the last point I'll make here is, as I already noted, we are in discussions with a couple of additional jurisdictions about Renewable 100 opt-ups. Those are Fremont and Oakland. Those are pretty active conversations, and we're discussing with them the idea of actually spreading that change, if it is approved by their city council, over the course of multiple years. And that would help manage a significant increase in renewable energy procurement. So it's we don't create as much of a price spike from our own demand. to give you a sense, those two cities are about 2 terawatt hours annual of energy for that load. That's about a quarter of our overall load. So you can imagine if suddenly in 1 year we opted all of those customers up to Renewable 100, what that would do for market pricing on renewable energy, where we are already seeing a highly elevated price point. So that's something we're trying to manage. I think even by spreading that over 2 or potentially even 3 years, we're likely to see some supply shortage and some impacts to pricing. Those will be future topics we would plan to bring forward to the board on rate setting, rate implications, and of course, as appropriate for approval of the actual opt-out decisions if the cities themselves approve it with their city council. So more to come on that front, but I think it is an important point to flag in context of our budget setting. Next slide, Rice, please. So on slide 11, this is a snapshot of our carbon-free procurement schedule. You can see the renewable percentage and the carbon-free, which is really large hydro, in the table to the top left. And those indicate the numbers I briefly touched on before of 71% in 2024 and 76% in calendar year 2025. Those were in the schedule in the latest board approved sort of scheduled to get to 100% emissions free by 2030. And you can see on the bottom left, those are the incremental increases to procurement that we have both had approved in the past and what we're proposing for this next budget cycle. And so you can see in for 24 and 25, obviously those being the relevant years. In 2023, we increased that from a 71% to a 10%. So that's as noted there in the increased column. And then the updated target is 81%. For 2024, that's the budget cycle we're discussing right now. We are not proposing any incremental increase to that 2024 calendar year. So that is held at 81%. And then for 2025, that's where we've proposed a 5% increase to large hydro. And that there's some level of staff discretion based off of where energy markets are at for either large hydro or renewables there to get to 81%. For 2026, we're really just showing that for context. Obviously, for next budget cycle, we would likely bring forward something that may modify that as well. But for right now, that is held at 81%, of course. Next slide, Raisa. We're on slide 12 now. This is in regards to reserve amounts. Given the strong financial forecast, we are proposing an allocation of $100 million to reserves. That is directly in line with what we have board approved for this particular fiscal year. The table to the top right, you can see in 23-24, that's the $100 million that's noted there. Obviously, we will need to see how things actualize, but certainly for right now, it is forecasted that we will be able to hit that level and then still have funds roll through the budget surplus waterfall. And you can see towards the right, you can see the balance of what the total reserves are. So at the end of this fiscal year, assuming we do hit that $100 million additional allocation, we would have about $331 million in total reserve balance. And to the right of that is OpEx to cover. So that's annual operating expenditures. Our reserve policy has a target of 50% of our annual operating expenditures with a range of 25 to 75%. So last percentage there, column to the right, you can see the percentages that we are assumed to hit. For the 24-25 budget year, with an additional $100 million in reserves, we would get to about $441 million. Our OpEx does increase significantly. That's driven by two things. One, generally increase in energy prices, and two, expansion to Stockton and Lathrop. And so you can see a significant increase in annual OpEx to about $1 billion. And that is why the percentage increase is a fairly modest increase. For this fiscal year, we expect to hit around 41%, with even an additional $100 million for the 24-25 fiscal year, we get to about 43%. So a modest step towards that for 50% target, but certainly it is on the horizon. I think that generally covers things. On the bottom right, we indicate the proposed surplus waterfall. So in prior years, we've had an allocation of the net position towards working capital. We have built up what we believe to be a sufficient balance there for free cash flow to sort of manage the working capital needs of the organization. So we are not proposing any incremental allocation to working capital, just $100 million to reserve contribution. And then below that, you can see this is based off of the current forecast for the net position. That would leave about $39 million. That would get split 50-50 to on-bill credits and the solar storage net billing tariff. That's what NBT stands for, incentive. And that's based off that transition from NEM 2.0 to quote unquote NEM 3.0. That allocation, this budget surplus proposal is in line with what we've had approved this year. We brought forward an item in January as a reminder to sort of discuss where we would allocate those funds. These were the two areas that were board approved. It is a slight modification on the allocation. In January, we approved a 60% allocation to on-bill credit and a 40% allocation to solar storage incentive. For simplicity here, we've just kept it 50-50. So just wanted to note that slight adjustment to what was approved in January. The last note I'll make here is the reason we've proposed the $100 million and the $39 million. $100 million, obviously, nice round number, meaningful chunk and contribution to our reserves. It's also generally sized at that $39 million to be about 5% of our energy costs. And certainly there's no limitation to say that energy costs won't have more variability outside 5%, but we've seen historically 5% is a pretty reasonable rule of thumb of where we see that variability year to year between budget and actuals. And so we feel like it is prudent to maintain some portion of the budget surplus, sort of call it at risk, not built into the base case adjustment for value proposition change for the CARE-FARA bill credits, and still preserving a meaningful allocation to reserve. So that's how that's sized. Next slide. Here we have a little bit more detail on the operating revenues. Many of these points we've already hit on, so I won't go into anything in too much detail, but you can see the breakdown of our gross electricity sales line item. The 1% of uncollectibles equates to that $9.8 million. And then we have some modest other operating revenue as well, which is, I believe, coming from damages and others, relatively small items. Next slide, Raisa. Here is a summary of all of the operating expenses. Obviously, the most significant portion of that is really related to cost of energy. It's around 90% of our overall annual OPEX. And then other overhead operating expenses. We'll go through each of these in a little bit more detail in following slides. And then non-operating expenses, you can see borrowing interest. That's really with our credit facility that we have. And then the local development funding at $22.4 million. Even though that's listed under the non-operating expenses section, that is treated as really an operating expense. The reason it's put it down there is because it's a capital transfer where even if we don't spend it in the particular fiscal year, we do maintain those funds for local development funding purposes and set that aside in a different capital account. And that's the reason why it sits in a non-operating expenses grouping. Next slide, Raisa. This is a little bit more detail on energy expenses. You can see in the bottom left graph, we're showing our fiscal year 25 in comparison to fiscal year 24. Very closely aligned, modest increases kind of across the board for the next fiscal year. You can see the most significant portion of that is in our hedges. A portion of that is in open unhedged position, though some of that is covered in terms of our PCIA risk management process. You can see capacity, which is resource adequacy, RECs, and then carbon free, which is really large hydro energy. Maybe two things I'll just note real fast. One is the PPAs line item is very small. And the reason for that is generally because our PPAs are really in the money. They're 10 to 20 year contracts. And so in these initial years, they are very favorable from an economic standpoint. So they show up as a very small graph because the costs actually net out with the value of those contracts. And the other thing that's noteworthy is for carbon free, you can see there's a pretty meaningful uptick. And part of that is because we have historically received a free allocation that is free, quote unquote, but really covered through the PCIA costs. And next year that may not occur. There's some level of discretion that PG&E has to offer a large hydro allocation or not. If they do not, it will It should balance out a little bit in the PCIA cost itself, but obviously that would increase our large hydro procurement costs. And so that's what that is a reflection of. Last note is just generally that we are at elevated energy costs. They're about 2 times historical averages, the last sort of 10-year average or so. So we'll continue to see that elevated energy price level. Next slide, Raisa. Overhead costs, you can see generally in line with the last budget year with an increase more or less across the board. I would say the most significant increases in personnel. We'll touch on that in a little bit more detail in the following slide. You can see marketing increases a bit there, and big driver of that is our local programs. So we are increasing our marketing expenditures to do things like managed charging, our EV tolling, EV charging infrastructure, things like that. Modest increase on legal, actually a little bit of a reduction in other professional services. Part of that is driven by, because of our increase in headcount, we're outsourcing less to outside consultants. Our G&A is generally in line, depreciation, nothing of note there. Next slide, Raisa. This is more detail on personnel. And so as I noted, probably the biggest increase in our overall overhead is related to personnel expenditures. We are recommending an additional 15 FTE for our current fiscal year. Assuming we close out all of the board approved hires, we'll end up at around 83. We are tracking for that. I believe we have 2 open positions, maybe 3 open positions that we expect to close out by the end of the fiscal year. So we'll end up at around 83. For the next budget year, we are proposing another 15 FTE. That would get us to about 98 people. And you can see a quick breakdown there of where the additional heads exist. And we'll actually show that line item by line item on the next slide. I'll just note that from a budget perspective, we assume those personnel are in for the full year. And realistically, we know that's not necessarily the case. Obviously, we're going to plan the hires. Recruitment always takes a little longer than you anticipate. So that's a little bit of a conservative budgeting approach, but that is what this reflects. And then you can see it's proposing a 3% increase based off of COLA, a 2% adjustment for promotions or wage adjustments, and then a 13% increase for merit-based compensation. It's noteworthy that recently, about a year ago, we changed our wage levels to standardize them across all job bands. That was very intentional to try to adjust and mitigate any risks related to biases and salary negotiations. That was a DEI-related initiative. So that's the primary reason why you see something like promotions and wage adjustments is a fairly small percentage. That's all equal across the board, and there's a heavier shift towards merit-based compensation at 13%. I know that's a little bit out of the norm for public agencies, but that's what that imbalance reflects. Next slide, Raisa. This is the detail on the additional 15 headcount request. You can see how that breaks down. There is a spread of that across the organization, 2 in finance, 1 in HR, 4 in local development. One of those roles still has some decisions and discussion necessary on really determining where it sits organizationally. 2 in marketing. One of those roles, obviously, as I noted, a lot of additional marketing work related to local development work. So even though it sits under marketing, it's driven mostly by local development. And then the outreach coordinator, as you can imagine, with expansion further into San Joaquin County, we do want local coverage of outreach events. That's what that role reflects. We have 4 power resources positions, heavy concentration on contracts and settlements management. As we just increase the number of PPAs and contracts that we have, it takes a lot of active management. And so that's what that reflects. And then a couple of policy or legal roles, 1 assistant board clerk role and a regulatory analyst position. So that's a kind of a full breakdown of the various personnel requests. Next slide, Raisa. Just a couple more slides here. Nothing too noteworthy on non-operating activity. Interest income increases, higher interest rate environment, as I already noted. Borrowing interest is related to our credit facility. As a reminder, we have a $200 million credit facility with US Bank. It's at very favorable borrowing costs. That was prior to interest rate increases. So very, very kind of low cost working capital insurance facility from our perspective. And then the $22.4 million in local development funding. We'll touch on that in more detail in the next slide. which we can go ahead and jump to now, Raisa. A little delay here. Last slide here. This is a breakdown of local development budget. We are proposing a $22.4 million allocation towards local development. That's in line, but a modest decrease from our current fiscal year. You can see we're adding on a number of areas that we are currently sort of prioritizing and putting efforts towards. So additional funding on critical municipal facilities. We're in the process of closing out a counterparty selection, awarding a contract there for about 60 or so sites across our city. So this would be additional funding on that program. Healthy Communities is a program that we've brought forward recently to the board for approval on vendor selection. There's an incremental $5 million allocated there. The DCFC, that's DC fast charging network, that's EV charging infrastructure. We have an existing program, board approval to put up to $30 million, not to exceed expense on that program. That's over a 10-year life. So this is an incremental $3 million. Sorry, not incremental, but that's a $3 million annual allocation related to that, not to exceed board approval that was previously provided. We have the AVA e-bike program, an incremental $2 million there. Building electrification, incremental $2 million there. And then the amounts start to get a little smaller. You can see community grants at $1.2 million. Vehicle electrification at $1 million. Legal expenses, of course, that is something significant that we always need in order to execute on these programs. Our solar and storage incentive line item, just quick clarification on that is we do have the sort of the upfront incentives coming out of this budget surplus for this fiscal year. We also have that forecasted for next fiscal year. This is related to the ongoing incentive piece of that same program. It's a fairly modest amount this next year because we're still working through NEM 2.0. We're expecting fairly modest installations for the new sort of NEM sort of phase. And then some modest subscription costs. So that is overall local development budget, and that is the last slide. So I will stop there and take questions and comments.
Any questions or comments from the directors? I recognized Director Anderson.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate the presentation and all the explanations that went along with the numbers. Thank you. A couple questions that I feel like come up every time we talk about the budget, so I would be remiss, or we would be remiss not to bring them up here. One is, can you remind us what our reserve goal is ultimately in terms of having a portion of our operating expenses set aside in reserve? Could you just speak a little bit more about what the end goal is there, whether it's a percentage or it's a number? That would be helpful.
Rice, can you actually pull up the deck? Because I think it's very number oriented, so it'd be helpful to have a reference. Slide 12 we're looking at. Our reserve policy states that we are targeting 50% of annual operating expenditures. So it is a percentage target, not a nominal dollar target. And there's a range of 25 to 75%. I think, so first let me talk to the numbers and talk to what that sort of range implies. So you can see in the current fiscal year 23-24, we have $100 million that is already board approved. We do expect to be able to hit that and allocate that. That would bring us to a balance of $331 million. And the OpEx is basically, it's a percentage of annual operating expenditures for the following 12-month period. So forward-looking year. That way we ensure we're capturing any forecast for energy price volatility. And in what is very meaningful here is our expansion into Stockton and Lathrop. So that's what that $810 million reflects. Is going forward from here, that 810 is really a reflection of the annual operating expenditures we have in this budget. And that gets us to about 41%. And then for the current draft budget that we're presenting, we are proposing another $100 million allocation. That would only occur, of course, depending on how the numbers actualize. It would get finalized in, after June 30th, 2025. That is as a percentage of roughly $1 billion in total annual operating expenditures. That is a forecast of the annual operating expenditures really covering 25 to 26. So certainly some uncertainty in that forecast. given that we're predicting energy prices, but is sort of our best estimate. The target is 50%. The range is 25 to 75%. So I think as we approach that 50% target, certainly there will need to be more meaningful dialogue with the board on what do we do beyond that. Are we trying to achieve 75%? Is it a different number? Is it 50%? And then we're significantly increasing our value proposition or putting it towards programmatic funding. It opens up a lot more discussion and opportunity to allocate that funding in other areas where right now, obviously, a significant portion is going towards reserves.
Great, thank you. And I have another question, if I may.
Please go ahead.
Okay, my next question is the question of whether or not to decouple our rate structure from PG&E. I know since the inception of East Bay Community Energy, now AVA, that we have been kind of pegged to a percentage above or a percentage below PG&E rates, and there has been some discussion from time to time about potentially not doing that, doing our own calculation. Could you speak to that question, because it does come up in my experience whenever we talk about the budget? Thank you.
Absolutely. I think, so just a quick note for context, most CCAs peg to the IOU within their territory. There's a few that have adjusted those rate structures. I think maybe 2 or 3 CCAs have done that. From our standpoint, I think the way we have indexed to PG&E is a reflection of cost of service. Obviously, a meaningful chunk is still being allocated towards things like reserves and local development funding, but it is a pretty accurate reflection of cost of service. Not a perfect reflection, because PG&E's rate structures are a reflection of cost of service for their broader service territory. And so given our climate and where we are situated, our load shapes are a little different from PG&E's average load shape, and therefore it's not a perfect reflection of cost of service. With that said, as we expand to City of Stockton and Lathrop, which are peakier and Central Coast based, different weather patterns, different peakier load shape, we actually are drawn more towards the average PG&E load shape as a result of that, at least at a high level. And so PG&E's rate structure, all that is to say, is PG&E's rate structure is a pretty good reflection of our cost of service. I think what is necessary from a discussion standpoint is what does AVA intend to do and want to do going forward? What is the benefit of adjusting our rate structures? We may say we want to adjust the time of use time frames a little bit because our peaks are a little different than, say, the PG&E average peaks. The challenge in doing that is, what is the benefit? Does it confuse communication with customers? Because the whole point of time of use is to adjust behavioral patterns. So if PG&E's T&D charges are based on a certain time of use structure, and we have a different time of use structure, we're confusing the communication with customers. We're actually a bigger chunk of their bill, which is based on T&D charges, has a different cost structure than our generation portion. And is that worth doing? Does that actually confuse the message, and then customers either ignore us and do it based off of the PG&E T&D charges, or does it actually cause them not to do anything at all because they're just confused by 2 different messages, and that creates chaos, and they don't do anything? So I think that's something more to evaluate, to understand what is the benefit of adjusting that rate structure. I think the 2 main takeaways I have to share are, we are generally a cost of service right now, even utilizing and indexing to PG&E rates. And the idea of shifting our rate structure to be something different has some significant downside in terms of customer communication, customer understanding, and consistency with the PG&E portion of the bill. So something important, and something that I think we'll want to bring forward to the board in the future as we're nearing our reserve target, to also think about, would we want to adjust this in a different way in terms of rate structures?
Okay, thank you.
Any other comments or questions?
Yeah, sure, if I could. So I've got some questions here in the boardroom.
Absolutely. Please go ahead, Director Gonzalez.
So the coastal cost of service.
What cost of service?
Coastal
cost.
Right, kind of where we were
10
years ago, 5 years ago. Is that lower than PG&E average?
Is your question, is our cost of service to serve our sort of coastal region at a lower level than PG&E average?
Yes.
Generally speaking, yes, because so
So PCIA has fallen. That's just a regulatorily set rate.
It is, the methodology is regulatorily set, and that changes year to year based off of energy prices. It looks at PG&E's portfolio of historical contracts and hedges that they've put in place. And if energy prices increase, those contracts are less out of the money or perhaps not out of the money, and therefore PCIA goes down.
So PCIA, is that it's up primarily because energy prices are up?
Well, PCIA is down right now.
I'm sorry,
Yeah,
said that
yes, that
backwards.
is correct. As energy prices go up, PCIA goes down. Yes. And they're at near, PCIA has, just as a quick note, is at near zero level.
Yeah, it's pretty small. So going to Member Anderson's question, and I struggle to understand my own electric bill sometimes.
Just imagine the average consumer.
Exactly, your energy procurement cost that you show is about, I'm gonna just say 10 cents a kilowatt hour. PG&E charges me 38 cents a kilowatt hour, some large number. It's meaningfully different from that. That's a blended cost reflecting transmission and distribution.
That's an aggregate, I believe, of the T&D charge and the generation charge, and it is an average because time of use, certainly your rates are different seasonally and hourly. So yes, that's a sort of gross simplification average of all things. Okay.
I just want to caveat that you do see on your bill that 38 cents from PG&E, but then there is a generation credit where they back out the portion that is just for the energy or the generation. So the delta between the credit and what they charge you is the T&D charge. But it's how their systems are set up that they show you that full bundled cost and then back out the generation.
Okay. And so when we talk about time of use pricing, and 99% sure that my bill says AVA for the generation. So then time of use, time of use to what you were describing is really time of use for T&D.
There's time of use for both generation and T&D.
Like in that structure, right? Because I'm allegedly on a really old plan, and so I'm just trying to figure out how this all works.
There is,
Like, do you guys set the time of use? Does PG&E set my time of use, or?
so the rate structure we have is indexed to PG&E, so it is one and the same. And those are PG&E set time of use rates that they've had PUC approved, and they have variability seasonally as well as hourly.
Sure.
So yes, the short answer is yes, they set it, and we've mirrored those rate structures.
And so whatever the case, it's 5% or 7% or whatever the number is, less, or I guess.
Well, you're probably on R100.
Yeah, I'm thinking it actually might be R100.
Yeah.
So I'm actually paying more than PG&E.
But it will have a,
100% renewable product, you know?
That's what I'm told.
but that premium is called out as its own billing line item called the Renewable 100
Okay.
adder, I think it is.
So that's useful to just try to, because again, I think that when it comes to what people think they're getting versus what they're actually getting, and that just the basic understanding of why is my bill whatever it is. I think Ms. Anderson covered the reserve percentage target. The big uncertainty is obviously in the cost of energy. And I noticed on one of these pages you had some hedges information.
I think it's slide 15. I don't know if you want to pull that up.
Yeah, so what I didn't know in this, because it had no scale.
Intentional, because we wanted to, we're trying to show you the relative level of comparison and the
This is
general
the
proportion.
relative proportion of cost driven by hedges as opposed to capacity charges.
Yeah, I think the most important takeaway we're really trying to show is year-to-year comparison. The proportional breakdown across the products, certainly relevant, important information. We're not trying to show you the dollar level costs, just due to sort of sensitivity of showing that publicly. And so the PPAs are bundled PPAs, very low in level, but actually fairly meaningful in terms of volumes. But that's because they're financially very attractive because they're sort of in the money contracts. That's why it shows up as a small bar.
Overall, all of these costs, except for PPAs, are going up.
Well, PPAs are also generally going up. Not that I'll speak to that in too much detail, but new
Yeah.
contracts were signed, things are just
More
trending.
expensive. This distribution on page 15
Mhm.
is a distribution for cost of energy services,
Just cost of energy.
cost of
Yeah,
energy.
cost of energy services is our billing services. It's
Well,
very.
that's why I was
yeah,
finding
yeah.
it confusing, to be
Yeah,
very clear.
yeah. So you can
because-
kind of, you can see it's a much smaller number, and that's a very well-known number, cost of energy
Got
services.
it, okay, so
Yeah.
then,
It's really a 750 million.
again, I'm trying to just kind of cut to the chase on this, sorry if it's taking so long. If these are relative proportions, that means that a big chunk of that $753 million in the proposed budget, or 682 actual, is hedging.
Yes.
We'll discuss that at another point in time.
I mean, these are all hedges in some way, shape, or I should say those are brown power hedges, pure power hedges, opposed to say capacity. Those are contracts for hedging resource adequacy. So those are hedges technically too.
Technically, I
Yeah.
do see that, but the other one is literally generation procurement, hedges on the price in the CAISO.
I mean, those are also source specified generation. Some of them are financial hedges, some of them are source specified hedges.
Maybe you can clarify that without getting into too much detail, because I was assuming that they were all financial hedges.
So some of them are financial hedges, some of them will do a resource specific financial hedge. Some of them will work with an energy supplier to do what is called an IST, an
Inter-scheduling coordinator of trade.
Right, so that is a through CAISO managed financial hedge that is backed by specific generation resources. But the contract is still done as a financial, sort of akin
Fair
to a
enough.
financial hedge, but it's a CAISO specific financial hedge.
There's an asset that goes behind it.
Yes, correct.
It's not just paper.
Yes.
The 50/50, 60/40 on page 12. Is that a request for change or is that a typo?
It was, I suppose, a request and change. It is technically ours most recent board approval was 60/40. So it was not a typo, it was intentional. And we did it for pure simplicity of saying, here are the levels, but certainly, of course, happy to take board direction if that was a very.
I think that for that one in particular, there was, I think, a fairly extensive discussion on this topic, not but a couple of, a few months
That's a good
ago.
point, yeah.
So I feel like,
Yeah.
that one makes me a little more
Yeah.
uncomfortable.
That's a good point. It was intentional, but to be honest, not very well thought through intentional. Like, we really should be balancing this. I think it was simplicity of.
Yeah.
Let's just put it. So if we would.
So
There's preference to show that,
we'll
yeah.
see kind of what other members think about that one, but that, just because we spend so much time talking about that.
Makes sense.
It's such a rainy year for the second year in a row. My brain says lots of hydro. So how is that actually working? And again, simplify the 45-second version. Is it mattering? We have all this rain?
Yeah, I mean, in a number of ways. Let me comment. I'll let Marie comment as well. But like 2 years ago, and 5 years preceding that, heavy drought situation.
Yeah.
Last year, extreme historically high rain levels. This year, kind of normal rain levels actually that we think are high rain levels, but actually in line with historical averages ish.
When we talk about the rain or the water year, the rain doesn't really matter. It's the snowpack.
Oh,
And
yeah, yeah.
I'm not totally up to date on the snowpack, but it is not, this year is not last year's snowpack.
For sure. That was
So-
2x.
Yeah, so, but it's the snowpack that determines the spring runoff, and if we're really lucky, is their summer runoff.
Yep.
So this year's runoff, not as much as last year, but again, I'm not up to date, like,
Okay.
I don't wanna give you
That
numbers.
was just, when I flew
But
back.
generally, higher rain is also milder weather, and what we saw last year was milder weather conditions, so energy prices were lower than expected, than
Okay.
forecasted. This year, we'll see what happens in the summer, but will the same thing happen? Perhaps. What we do have when we talk about large hydro and carbon-free procurements, previously, prior to last year, there was not as much of it, and those prices were getting somewhat elevated. Last year, we got a very significant allocation. And this year, TBD, it would probably be in between the last year and the year before.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then Chair, if I may, a couple more questions.
Please go ahead, Director Gonzalez.
So I've got you have personnel, you lay out the proposed increases on page 18. What's like the top two most important positions there? Like what's really critical?
I mean,
If the board were to push back, where would you accept pushback?
I feel like you just asked me and Marie to arm wrestle.
So that's why you're on opposite ends.
Off by 30.
I think it would be quite challenging to say two, because there's such different roles. We have meaningful, additions to local development we're trying to do. We have very meaningful roles under power resources,
Let's
more
just take
contracts.
local development. I'm just jump on one, just to try to have a little bit of a discussion. Local development. When I hear the word development, I think about growing service territory. Are you talking about serving service territory? Like connecting? What do you mean by local development?
We're speaking to programs, things like launching our portfolio of EV charging infrastructure. We have
Making it happen.
making it
All
happen.
that 13,
Go signing
20
the,
some odd
we have
million.
10 sites identified, going get the next 10 sites with our city members and working through site lease agreements.
Got it.
Actually building the infrastructure, doing the marketing related to getting customers to those sites, things like that.
And no disrespect from that. Who covers which? I'm assuming this benefits. I mean, obviously 90% of what we do is energy procurement and managing the risk associated with that. So just all else being equal, I want to make sure that that's nailed. That we have it absolutely, strongly controlled as we can, just for fear that if that went sideways, we could be in trouble. Okay, and then my last question, you explained the, 13% merit-based increase. I think this is something that could catch public attention. Inflation is materially down, and yet this seems to be suggesting wages are materially up. And so some sort of, I'll just say, better explanation of that, I think would be useful in case somebody latches onto that. So that's it's kind of a question, but not really. The question is, I didn't
Be
really
prepared for
I
it.
didn't understand your explanation. So I'm not
I don't know
so
if you
sure.
want me to
I'm not
elaborate
sure
a
that I
little bit
really
now, or-
want you to explain it again, but I'm just kind of, we'll leave
Understood.
that as an open question to be more clearly explained later. Why 13% in a lower inflation environment is appropriate. So thank you, Madam Chair, for indulging me.
You are welcome, Director Gonzalez. Any other questions? Director Anderson, Director Gonzalez? Thank you so much for the presentation. Those were some very good questions and a great presentation. We can move on to the next item on the agenda. And
Sorry,
is-
Director Core.
Oh, I'm sorry. Are there any public comments?
We have one member of the public with their hand raised. Local Clean Energy Alliance, you're recognized for 2 minutes.
Thanks.
Local Clean Energy Alliance.
Jessica? Are they on mute? Oh, great.
Okay, now I'm unmuted. Sorry, I was talking to myself. Jessica Tovar, Local Clean Energy Alliance. Yeah, I wanted to first highlight my organization advocated for a local development business plan, which is the roadmap for how to do community investments over time. And so the local development business plan really is something that I think needs to be uplifted again, because I feel like it's kind of been forgotten, and there's a lot of gems in there for how to do local investments that rely less on that market purchase. We understand that we're not going to be able to cover all the electricity needs, you know, with local development alone, but we understand that we could be producing more localized clean energy. We can be doing a lot more investments in electrification and community investments in community innovation. And so I just want to uplift the importance of that and not to lose sight of that. I also wanted to address on the community, what's now called community grants. That's actually supposed to be grants for community-based organizations and seed funding, but it's been used to promote programs within the agency, and it really is not what it was designed to be. So that is one of my concerns, is that this money is actually not reaching community-based organizations. And so I want to uplift that, and also just noting that more money should be allocated to providing seed funding for community innovation. That's what started this agency in the first place. I know I'm running out of time. We could talk here forever, but I do think that the agency could do more to help community-based organizations throughout the territory that work directly with impacted communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Are there any other public comments?
There are no other members of the public with their hand raised.
Director Anderson, did you have a question, clarification, or a comment?
I have a comment when the time is appropriate.
Should
Okay, so I
Marissa,
just.
please go ahead.
Thank you. So I just wanted to acknowledge the comment that Member Gonzalez made with respect to the allocation, the 60-40. My recollection is also the same, that we spent quite a lot of time talking about that. And I guess one of the things that might be helpful when this comes to the larger board of directors is to really be thinking about the pressure that our constituencies are facing with electricity costs. I should say cost of electricity, and what we can be doing as an agency to help alleviate those costs. And I realize that the percentage discount you're talking about will, addresses that to some extent, but also the waterfall speaks to that as well. So I just want to keep that front and center because it is the cost of electricity and all types of energy is just, it's really hampering the personal finances of a lot of our residents in our service area. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Anderson. Any further comments from the directors? Although I think the time for discussion has passed for that item though. So perhaps we can go on to the next item if there's no further public comment.
Can I just ask for quick clarification on that last topic on the budget surplus? Is there a preference from this committee to have us alter that so it's 60-40 and present that in the regular board meeting, next week with that detail? I'll quickly note that executive committee didn't make the same comment, though we didn't spend much time on it, to be frank. So I wouldn't expect they would take issue with that.
Chair, my personal preference would be to go 60-40, but I'm open to what you guys would say as well.
So this is a information item, and if there is perhaps we can discuss it at the time of future board agenda items.
Okay, I'm sure this will be a topic that is just addressed next week. So.
All right, so should we go on to the next item number 5, auditor selection, if there's no further public comment?
Okay, hi, Jason Bartlett, Senior Finance Manager at AVA. I'll be presenting the auditor selection. So if we could please go to the next slide. So a little background is our quarterly and annual financial statements are generated through our accounting firm, Maher Accountancy. And then each year we hire an external qualified CPA firm to audit those annual financial statements. The audit officially starts in July and generally ends in October. or November timeframe, depending upon you know, when the board schedules occur and when the audit is complete. The audited financial statements are presented to the board in that meeting, along with any other related items such as surplus allocations, reserve allocations, and whatnot. Passetti and Brinker has been our financial auditor for the last 6 consecutive years, and in particular with Brett Bradford as the lead audit partner. There is a bit of a wrinkle here in that I wanted to note that section 12410.6B, the California Government Code states a local agency must change lead audit partner at least once every 6 years. And so to that end, AVA conducted a new RFP for auditor services in February. And PMB submitted a proposal, and they explicitly stated a different lead partner, Kellen Gilbert, to replace Brett Bradford. And so we did review the responding firms, and PMB did score the highest in its review and is the staff's recommendation for audit services. If we could go to the next slide, please. So this is a little more detail on that government code cited, and this is it in its context and entirety, but drawing attention to the kind of middle of the third line. It says, okay, so to give a little more, I guess, efforts around that, I'll start at the second line. A local agency shall not employ a public accounting firm to provide audit services to a local agency if the lead audit partner or consulting audit partner having primary responsibility for the audit or the audit partner responsible for reviewing the audit has performed audit services for that local agency for 6 consecutive years. That's really the meat. There are obviously some additional clarifying terms around that, but we did put this to our legal team for review, and they have concluded that the proposal submitted by PMB does satisfy the necessary cycling of lead audit partners. So we are allowed to continue legally with PMB if we so choose. So next slide, please. So the RFP, as I said, was issued in February. Each received proposal was reviewed by staff and processed through a standardized rubric that we have and ranked based on evaluating criteria. There were 2 neck and neck responses. Baker Tilly, who conducts audit services for MCE, CPA, and then a couple of our energy services partners, NCPA and SMUD. And they also provide similar services for other public utilities around the state. And then Passetti and Brinker, who has been our auditor for the last 6 years and also continues to provide audit services for other CCAs, PCE, Sonoma Clean Power, SVCE, and other public entities across the state as well. So we interviewed these 2 firms, and based on the evaluations of the proposals and the response to the interviews, PMB did make a noticeable move ahead in this kind of neck horse race. Next slide, please. And so the things that really kind of set PMB apart was, they have a very material depth of CCA experience, more so than Baker Tilly. Through the interview, it came out that they have provided these additional audit services for a wide variety of CCAs. Also, we have established systems and audit processes with PMB that can create efficiencies in the conduction of the audit. One note is there's a regulatory proceeding related to new financial security requirements underway that may require 1 to 2 formal audits annually. So a known audit provider may assist in new meetings for regulatory needs. So that can definitely increase the speed and the efficiencies in which these kind of more singular audits, as they are known, get are reviewed. They also had a pretty competitive fee agreement. Their rates were lower than Baker Tilly's. And they did not include, although both did kind of increase at a rate year over year, P&B did not have an additional 3% Baker fee that Baker Tilly has an add-on as an administration fee. Also, P&B is very familiar with Ava's finances, so it's not just systems, but it's also that they're familiar with the transactional arrangements, our controls. They've audited our controls already, so they can identify changes more readily, I think. And then also a final consideration is their location. They are local to California, specifically Sonoma County. They are also privately owned and operated by its principal partners, whereas Baker Tilly is more national and publicly traded. Next slide, please. So our recommendation is to proceed with an engagement with P&B, and we're kind of asking for some guidance here. We have two recommendations. One is a 3-year commitment with the option to extend and renew for an additional 3 years for a total length not to exceed 6 years, or just completely engage with a full 6-year commitment. Staff is requesting the approval to continue with P&B Audit Services under Kellen Gilbert as the lead partner. We are also requesting feedback on the above recommendation as to which would be best to bring forward. And just to be clear, the next steps in this is that we intend to bring this to the board next week. And at which point, upon approval, we would then amend the current contract to align with board approval and then initiate audit engagement in July. And so that's the recommendation, and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for the presentation. Are there any questions or clarifications from the directors?
And so just, Sheriff, are we going to do discussion now or just questions?
Questions and clarifications now. Director Gonzalez, and I recognize Director Anderson, as I saw that she had raised her hand.
Yes, and actually requesting the same clarification. So we'll ask questions now and then we'll have a chance to discuss. That's great. So my question is, does staff have a preference as between the 3-year with a 3-year extender or a 6-year contract?
I would say that for ease of engagement, this full 6-year engagement would be easiest, because then we wouldn't have to bring it back to the board within 3 years. But that is a very nominal ask, if at all. Really, the option is there as a condition for in case the board changes their mind with the audit services being provided.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
So here in the boardroom,
You recognize Director Gonzalez.
so the financial security requirement, what is this?
So regulatory proceeding where CCA specifically will increase the posting requirement that they have with the IOU that serves in that territory. So for us, PG&E, we actually would post to them in the unlikely event that a CCA no longer serves its customers and are returned to the IOU, then the IOU has some level of sort of cash security there to help support that, that sudden serving of customers. That is historically, there's always been something in place. It's been a relatively modest level. There's been a regulatory proceeding to adjust that methodology, and that amount is increasing. But that's one matter that is not really directly related to this particular item. But one of the requirements they have there right now in the proposed, I believe it's a proposed decision, is two audits a year, which is very out of the norm. Mm-hmm. We are submitting comments to try to reduce that to one annual audit, which is the norm. So we'll see what happens, but that was simply a comment to say, if there are two, having an efficient audit service provider is quite critical to be able to get two audits done a year.
Was the executive committee involved in interviewing the auditor and reviewing the proposals?
No, just staff and FAP.
We did do outreach on an ad hoc basis with board members for input, but not direct part of the interview process.
Director Anderson, if that, is that Director Gonzalez, do you have any follow-ups on that?
Those are my questions.
Thank you. Director Anderson, you're recognized.
Thank you. I do have a follow-up to Member Gonzalez's inquiry, and it's really, does the contract dollar amount change if there are indeed two audits a year? Because presumably that is more work then for our audit partner. So I'm just curious if there is another range that we should be considering.
Yes, if that is correct. If this ruling does require or does allow PG&E to require two formal audits per year, then costs would increase. We don't have a quote for that, but that would be out of scope with the service that we're seeking. I imagine it would probably double costs, given it's double audits.
There would be a separate discussion to
Yeah.
evaluate the services and the costs associated with it. So
Exactly. Yeah, and that would also be an amendment that we would bring to the board. So
That's right.
So it wouldn't,
Okay.
it wouldn't just be made in isolation.
Thank you.
And I do want to just be clear. I'm hopeful that there will not be a requirement for two audits a year. That's pretty uncommon, but it also has been somewhat surprising in the forum that there is a request for two, and that hasn't been easily removed. So simply highlighting that as a risk, one additional factor for why we are recommending sticking with P&B. If we were to have such what I would deem to be somewhat of an onerous requirement, you really want somebody that you've had some history and familiarity with, completing audits. Hopefully, there's only one annual audit.
Hopefully, right. Okay, I have some comments as well, but I can hold those for now. Thank you.
I do have one follow-up question.
You're recognized, Director Gonzalez.
We made the distinction about audit partner. I think what it all means is that we're rotating the audit partner.
Correct.
So there's a new person.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Any further questions or clarifications? None. Are there any public comments on this item?
There are no members of the public with their hand raised.
Thank you. Discussions? You're recognized, Director Anderson.
Thank you. So I just want to comment. I was on the ad hoc committee this past year, so I did get to interact with. I'm gonna say it's. Can you say the name?
Bradford?
No, I was trying to say the name of the firm.
Pisetti and Brinker.
Thank you. And I found them, as well as the audit partner, to be very professional and very knowledgeable. And I am familiar with the requirement to switch audit partners so that you have a new set of eyes working on this. And I am comfortable personally with continuing with the firm overall and rotating to a new head lead partner. I don't have a super strong preference, and I don't know if my colleagues do, of the 3-year with the 3-year extension or the 6-year contract. So curious to know more about that.
So my comments would be, as we continue to grow as an organization and go through that $1 billion threshold and then maybe onto a $2 billion organization, that we are thinking more about national audit presence, just kind of a firm of greater prominence. I think so when I heard Baker Tilly, there was kind of a natural inclination there, but it's not that big a deal to me. I think that because of that and our growth, I'm inclined to a 3+3 as opposed to a 6. I'm new to this world of government agencies and kind of public, this type of public. I'm very accustomed to the audit committee in the corporate world making the decision, right? Meeting with, and I don't know if that's the analog would be the executive committee here or this committee, and making a recommendation for full approval to the board. So just from a process perspective, I offer that as a comment. Again, nothing, I see no need to derail what's happening here, but I'm just trying to figure it out myself right now.
Can I just clarify, is that a suggestion that amongst the FAP subcommittee to approve moving forward with P&B and then moving forward to the board, or is that a comment that?
Just more in terms of when I think of auditors being chosen in the public company realm, the audit committee of the board is interviewing auditors, making that assessment, because it really is independent of staff. Who resonates with the board, not who resonates with staff, because they are independent. They're outsiders kind of looking in.
Right.
And while I appreciate the efficiencies that come from ongoing relationships and having come from an audit firm, you always want to work well with the client. The ultimate client in some way was always the board and the public. And so I'm just trying to analogize here to what that should look and feel like.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, we did engage on an ad hoc manner with certain board members for that exact, because we felt that we didn't want to make this decision in isolation, so we did seek that.
And for the record, I was asked about, possible auditors to consider, right? So just to be clear there, but it's more in the selection, the interview, anyway.
Okay.
So I think enough said on that without, I am fine recommending that we move forward. My recommendation, my input would be 3+3.
Are there any further discussion comments? You're recognized, Director Anderson.
Thank you so much. I would agree with that approach as outlined by Member Gonzalez and as put forth by staff. Thank you.
Since this is an informational item, are there any other comments or anything from Ava? Nothing further from Ava? Okay, so I suppose this informational item will come at some point for a vote in front of the board of directors at Ava, correct?
Correct, next week.
Great, so we can maybe proceed. I see both of these items are coming up next week for a vote, correct?
This one will be going forward for a vote. The budget will not be a vote.
I see. Thank you for clarifying. So any requests to place items on future board agenda? I see some it doesn't appear that way. In that case, the financial, administrative, and procurement subcommittee meeting is adjourned. The next one will be held on Wednesday, July 10, 2024 at 1 p.m. in conference room 5 at Ava Community Energy, located at 1999 Harrison Street, Suite 2300, Oakland, California, 94612, and any other remote locations that are placed on the agenda.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We are hereby adjourned.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.